Have you ever stopped to think about how many people simply disappear without leaving a single trace? No witnesses, no answers, no one looking. Now imagine this happening not once, not twice, but dozens of times in the same place. And the scariest part? No one noticed. For nearly an entire decade, bodies began appearing in isolated locations, empty roads, abandoned lots, canal banks, in the southern United States. Young men, alone, forgotten, and for a long time, no one connected the dots, because these victims were invisible. This is the kind of story that unsettles you, not just because of what happened, but because of how long it took for someone to realize something was very wrong. And when they finally did, it was already too late for many of them. Today, you're going to hear the story of one of the most disturbing cases, a case that stayed hidden in the shadows for years, and of a man who seemed completely incapable of harming anyone. But he did, and he did it for years, without raising suspicion, without being stopped, until he made a single mistake. It all began almost imperceptibly. It was 1997. A 19-year-old young man disappeared after hitchhiking home from an event. 2 days later, his body was found on an isolated road. At that moment, nothing suggested it was part of something bigger. It seemed like an isolated case, maybe an accident, maybe something that would never be fully explained. Life went on. Until, months later, another body appeared. Same region, similar profile, another young man, and then a small doubt began to form. Coincidence or pattern? Even so, there was still no panic, no headlines, because the victims had something in common. They weren't people society usually looks for, and that changed everything. As months passed, the bodies began appearing more frequently, some in abandoned lots, others near industrial areas, many left in places where they would be quickly found, as if whoever did this wanted them discovered, but at the same time, didn't want to be discovered, because the victims shared specific traits. Young men, many in vulnerable situations, some without stable housing, others struggling with substance abuse, people who, unfortunately, already lived on the margins of society. And that had a direct impact on the investigation, because when someone like that disappears, often no one reports it right away. Sometimes, no one reports it at all. And when a body is found without quick identification, the case goes cold before it even begins. This created the perfect scenario for something terrifying: a killer operating freely. Over time, investigators began noticing clearer patterns. Some victims showed signs of being restrained before death. Others indicated there had been some kind of struggle. But the most intriguing part was this: many of them showed no significant signs of resistance, as if, at some point, they had trusted the person they were with, or at least, hadn't realized the danger in time. This raised a disturbing hypothesis. The person responsible didn't attack randomly. He approached, he talked, he convinced, and only then, he acted. Meanwhile, the bodies kept appearing, and still, the case didn't get attention. No major protests, no massive coverage, no sufficient public pressure. It was as if those lives didn't matter as much, and that gave the person responsible exactly what he needed: time. A lot of time. Time to repeat, time to refine, time to continue, without interruption. But here's the most disturbing point of this entire story. During all this time, the person responsible lived a normal life, without raising suspicion, without a history that stood out, without that classic profile we tend to imagine. No visible aggressive behavior, no intimidating presence, nothing that screamed danger. On the contrary, those who knew him described him as someone ordinary, even forgettable, someone who could pass you on the street, and you'd never remember his face. And maybe that's what makes it even harder to accept. Because when we think of someone capable of causing so much suffering, we expect to recognize the signs, but they're not always there. Sometimes, danger looks invisible. As the years passed, the number of victims grew, and with it, the urgency. Investigators began working with a possibility that once seemed distant. They weren't dealing with isolated cases. They were dealing with a single perpetrator, someone who knew the area, someone who knew exactly where to act, someone who chose his victims carefully, and most importantly, someone who knew how to avoid being caught. But even with that suspicion, something essential was missing: a direct connection, a name, a concrete piece of evidence. Without that, everything remained just theory, and meanwhile, more lives were at risk. Time passed, and the question grew heavier. How many more? How many more until someone could stop this? And maybe the most agonizing question of all: how can someone do this for so long, without anyone noticing? But the answer would begin to emerge from where no one expected. Not from a brilliant investigation, not from a major operation, but from something much simpler, something almost accidental. A moment when the plan failed, a moment when someone survived. And that was exactly what started bringing everything down. Now imagine this scene with me. You're walking alone at night, tired, maybe needing help, maybe looking for a way to get home. And then someone stops, offers help, speaks calmly, no rush, no pressure, seems safe, seems normal. And that's exactly where everything begins. The pattern investigators began piecing together was quiet, but extremely consistent. The perpetrator didn't act impulsively. He selected, observed, waited for the right moment. Usually, he drove through areas where he knew he'd find more vulnerable people. Places where men were often alone late at night. People walking, without transportation, without company. People who, most of the time, would accept a ride. And that detail changes everything, because it wasn't a forced attack, it was an invitation. The victim got into the vehicle by choice, without imagining what would come next. After that, everything changed. Reports and evidence indicated that at some point, during the encounter, things stopped being friendly, and control shifted completely into his hands. Victims were restrained, no chance to react, no time to understand, no way out. But here's something that deeply intrigued investigators. Many of these victims were physically capable of defending themselves. Some were strong young men. Even so, there were no clear signs of struggle in many cases, which raises an unsettling question. Did they realize too late? Or did they, until the very end, still believe they were safe? Over the years, the perpetrator's behavior began to change. At first, the intervals between cases were longer, months, then weeks, and then less and less time between each case, as if something inside him was accelerating, as if the need was growing. And this is something criminal behavior experts often observe. Once this kind of pattern starts, it rarely slows down on its own. Meanwhile, the investigation faced a massive problem. No direct connection, no witnesses, no clear suspect, and for a long time, not even a database capable of accurately cross-referencing information. But something was being collected, silently, at every scene, in every analysis. Small fragments of evidence that didn't lead anywhere yet, but would later become essential. And in the middle of all this, he kept living normally, working, socializing, existing like anyone else, without raising suspicion. Those who knew him described someone completely ordinary, reserved, with few friends, no strong presence, the kind of person who goes unnoticed in any environment. And maybe that was one of the biggest factors that allowed all this to continue, because no one was looking for someone like him. But behind that appearance, there was a story marked by rejection, social difficulties, and a constant feeling of not belonging. During his youth, he struggled to connect with others. He was teased, felt out of place. And over time, that began to build something deeper, something quiet, something that didn't show, but grew. When he finally began living more independently, something changed. For the first time, he had control over his own space, his own environment, and maybe, for the first time in his life, he felt some kind of power. And that detail matters, because many experts point out that in cases like this, control is a central factor. It's not just about the act itself. It's about dominating the situation, deciding, having power over another person. But even so, none of that justifies what happened, and even less explains how it went on for so long. While investigators tried to move forward, something from his past began gaining relevance. Years earlier, he had already been accused in situations involving extremely concerning behavior, reports of encounters that started consensually, but ended with the other person trying to escape. Cases that, for different reasons, never fully moved forward. And here's a difficult point to ignore. If those situations had been pursued, if there had been deeper investigation, could all of this have been stopped earlier? That's a question that will never have a definitive answer, but it always lingers. Another significant detail happened during a period when he was in custody, an experience that, according to later reports, had a deep impact on him, something that increased his fear and his need for control. From that point on, the pattern solidified. He didn't just want to control the situation. He wanted to eliminate any possibility of consequences. And that led to a decision that would change everything, ensuring no one could speak afterward. This is the moment when the case stops being just disturbing and becomes something even darker, because it shows a level of planning, of intent, of repetition, and still, he remained invisible. Year after year, more victims, more silence, more unanswered questions, until something changed, something small, but enough. Not every encounter followed the same script. Not every attempt ended the same way. And in one of those moments, something went wrong. Someone managed to escape. Someone survived. And most importantly, someone spoke. And that was the moment. Everything started to collapse. Now everything changes. After years without answers, without suspects, without direction, finally, someone comes forward with a story. And it wasn't just any story. It was the kind that makes investigators stop everything. This man sought help after a strange experience. He said he was walking alone when he was approached by someone in a vehicle. The conversation started normally, nothing unusual, until the driver made a proposal. He said he knew someone, a woman, who would pay for an encounter. He even showed a photo, an attempt to make it more convincing, more real, and it worked. Because for someone in a vulnerable situation, tired, without money, without many options, it seemed like an opportunity, but there was a condition. Before anything, he would have to be tied up. For safety, because according to the driver, the woman was afraid of men, afraid to get close. Now think about that for a second. Everything is built to seem plausible, an emotional story, a justification, a reason, but still, something didn't feel right. And this time, the victim realized. He refused, said he wouldn't do it, insisted on leaving. And unlike many other cases, he succeeded, got out of the vehicle, walked away, alive. But most importantly, he chose to speak. That report reached the authorities, and for the first time, they had something different, something concrete, a clear pattern, a specific approach. It was no longer just about bodies being found. Now there was a described behavior, a strategy, a method, and that completely changed the game. From that moment on, investigators began connecting dots that had once seemed unrelated. The woman proposal, the demand for restraint, the use of stories to persuade. Everything started to make sense. And most importantly, it explained something that had once seemed unexplainable. Why so many victims showed no signs of resistance. Because many of them agreed. They didn't know. They couldn't have known. With this new information, investigators revisited old cases, reanalyzed evidence, reviewed patterns, and began focusing on something essential. Who would be capable of doing this? Who had access to these areas? Who had time, mobility, and knowledge? And that's when one detail stood out. An address, a location that appeared, directly or indirectly, near several places where bodies had been found. A name began to emerge, not yet as proof, but as a possibility. He wasn't an obvious suspect, no extensive criminal history, not known for violence, but there was something there. A past, some old accusations, reports that at the time hadn't been pursued, and suddenly, he was being watched. Surveillance began, discreet, constant, 24 hours a day. But here's another detail that surprised even investigators. He did almost nothing. Didn't go to bars, didn't go out much, had no active social life. He worked, came home, and stayed there. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that directly indicated what was happening. It was like watching a completely ordinary person, and that raised an unsettling doubt. Is it really him? Or are they looking at the wrong person? But there was a problem. They still had no proof, no direct link, nothing to support a formal accusation. And then, they made a crucial decision to approach him. No pressure, no direct accusation, just a conversation. 2 investigators went to him, asked general questions, explained they were investigating cases in the area, and asked if he'd be willing to cooperate. And his answer was yes. He talked, answered, and did something that, at the time, seemed like just a detail, but would change everything. He agreed to provide DNA. Maybe he didn't understand how serious that was. Maybe he thought there wasn't enough connection, or maybe he believed he'd never be caught. But that simple gesture was the beginning of the end. Now everything depended on an analysis, a result, a comparison. Meanwhile, investigators knew one thing. If it was him, they were dealing with someone extremely dangerous, and they couldn't make a mistake, because every day could mean another victim. And then, the result came in. The result came in, and with it, silence. That heavy kind of silence. That only happens when everyone in the room understands, before anyone says it out loud. It was him. The DNA matched evidence found in one of the earlier cases. After years of doubt, of theories, of failed attempts, there was finally a concrete connection. Undeniable, scientific, irrefutable. And in that moment, everything changed. Now it wasn't suspicion anymore. It was certainty. But along with that confirmation came something even more terrifying. If he was linked to one case, how many others was he connected to? The answer came quickly. New analyses, new comparisons, and one by one, the pieces fell into place. Cases that once seemed isolated were now connected, and the number kept growing. It was far bigger than anyone imagined. Investigators knew they couldn't wait. There was no more time for passive surveillance. No margin for error. It was time to act. When they finally went to him, there was no resistance, no attempt to flee, no confrontation. And that alone was strange. Because usually, when someone realizes they're about to be caught, there's a reaction, denial, desperation. But there, no. He was found in a simple environment, no signs of preparation, no attempt to hide anything. It seemed like he already knew, and maybe he did. Because from that moment on, something completely unexpected happened. During the interrogation, he started talking, and not just a little. It was like a dam had burst. He gave details, explained situations, described encounters. And the more he spoke, the clearer it became. They weren't dealing with just a suspect. They were facing one of the most extensive and disturbing cases ever recorded in that region. He confessed, case after case, without hesitation, without resistance. And that left even the investigators unsettled, because there was none of the usual denial, no attempt to escape. It was almost like he wanted to talk, and maybe, deep down, he did. During the interrogation, he explained how it all started, how he approached victims, how he built trust, how he convinced them, and most importantly, how he maintained control. Everything was planned. Nothing was entirely random. He went out at night, drove through specific areas, observed, chose. And when he found someone who fit the profile, he initiated contact, the conversation, the proposal, the story, all appearing normal. But there was a crucial point. If the person refused, he simply left. No pressure, no force. Now think about that. That means there were several people who were just minutes away from becoming victims and never knew it. But when someone accepted, everything changed. He took them to an isolated location, usually his own residence, and there, everything happened. Without unnecessary details, the pattern was always the same. Total control. And then, silence. He described how he disposed of the bodies, how he chose the locations, and why. Many were left in places where they would be found. And that wasn't a mistake. It was intentional, as if there was a need for them to be seen, but not linked to him. And for a long time, it worked. It worked because the victims were invisible. It worked because no one was paying close enough attention. It worked because he seemed incapable of doing such things. But now, everything was exposed, and as the confessions continued, the final number began to take shape. More than 20 victims. 23 lives taken. And maybe even more that were never found. When that information came out, the impact was enormous, not just because of the number, but because of the time. Nearly an entire decade of continuous activity, without interruption, without identification, and that raised an unavoidable question. How was this possible? How can someone do this for so long, without being stopped? The answer isn't simple, but it involves several factors. Lack of connection between cases, lack of visibility for the victims, technological limitations at the time, and most importantly, the way he operated. Quiet, discreet, invisible. But in the end, that's not what brought him down. It wasn't the pattern. It wasn't the behavior. It wasn't traditional investigation. It was something much simpler. A mistake. A single mistake. He let someone go, and that person spoke. And that was what ended everything. But even with the arrest, the story wasn't over, because now came another stage, justice, and perhaps even more importantly, the attempt to understand. The arrest was just the beginning, because when someone like him is finally identified, the question is no longer just who did this, it becomes, how did no one see it sooner? With the confirmation of the crimes came an avalanche of information, families being notified, old cases being reopened, stories being rebuilt, piece by piece. And then, the numbers stopped being just numbers. Each victim had a name, a story, a family, children, siblings, parents, people who, despite living on the margins, were loved. And that's something that's often forgotten in cases like this. Because for years, these victims were treated like statistics. But to someone, each one of them meant everything. And when the truth came out, so did years of accumulated pain, families who never had answers, who never knew exactly what happened, who lived with doubt, with guilt, with silence, and now They were faced with a reality that was hard to accept. But there was another side too. Relief. From finally knowing. From finally having someone responsible. From finally understanding that it wasn't just an unexplained disappearance. It was something done. And now, there was justice, or at least, something close to it. During the legal process, an important decision was made to avoid a long trial, because every detail exposed would mean reliving everything all over again. And for many families, that would be unbearable. So a deal was made. He would formally confess, and in return, he would avoid the maximum penalty. It may seem controversial, but here's an important point. Justice isn't always about maximum punishment. Sometimes, it's about closing a chapter, and that's what happened. He was sentenced to multiple life terms, without the possibility of release, one after another, ensuring he would never walk free again, and, in a way, ensuring there would be no more victims. But even then, some questions remained. Questions that may never have answers. How many were there really? Because although the official number is high, there's always the possibility of other cases that were never discovered. And that still lingers. Another difficult question. How many of these deaths could have been prevented? If the early warning signs had been taken more seriously, if earlier reports had been investigated more deeply, if someone had connected the dots sooner. But that kind of reflection always comes afterward. And unfortunately, too late. Experts analyzed the case trying to understand what led to all of this. And a psychological pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just violence, it was control, total control. A distorted attempt to fill something internal, to feel power, to compensate for a life marked by rejection, isolation, and frustration. But here's something important. Understanding does not mean justifying. Nothing that happened can be justified. And perhaps the most disturbing part of all is realizing how normal he seemed. No alarming history, no explosive behavior, none of the stereotype we expect. Just someone who went unnoticed. And that forces us to face an uncomfortable reality. Danger doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks ordinary, and that's exactly what makes it so hard to detect. But in the middle of all this, there's something that cannot be ignored. A single decision, a single choice. That changed everything. The decision to spare a life, or maybe the failure to carry the plan through. And that was what allowed someone to speak, to tell what happened, and to bring everything to light. It shows something powerful, even in extremely dark situations. A small detail can completely change the outcome. One mistake, and that mistake ended nearly a decade of crimes. But it also left behind a difficult legacy, a reminder of how society sees certain people, of who gets attention and who is ignored. Because if these victims had been treated with more visibility from the start, maybe the story would have been different. Maybe fewer lives would have been lost. And that reflection goes beyond this case. It's about empathy, about seeing everyone, not just some, because no one should be invisible. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. But before we end, there's one more thing. Because this story doesn't end with the arrest. It leaves an impact, and that impact is still felt today. Even after the conviction, the case wasn't simply closed. Because stories like this don't end when the person responsible is arrested. They continue. In the memories of families, in the minds of investigators, and especially in the questions that will never be fully answered. One of the biggest lingering questions is this: how many people crossed paths with him and didn't recognize the danger? Because as he himself described, not every encounter ended the same way. Many people refused. Many simply walked away and went on with their lives, never knowing how close they came to something irreversible. That completely changes how we see this story. Because we're not just talking about confirmed victims, we're talking about an unknown number of encounters, moments, decisions that could have ended very differently. and that's terrifying. Another point that left deep marks was the impact on the community. For years, everything happened in silence. But once it came to light, the shock was unavoidable. People started looking back, remembering moments, thinking, I've been down that road. I was there at that time. And suddenly, ordinary places took on a different meaning. Roads, empty lots, seemingly normal areas. Everything began to carry a different memory. And that's something many places face after cases like this. The sense of safety changes. Even if the person responsible is no longer there, the memory remains. But perhaps the deepest impact was something else. The way this case exposed something uncomfortable about society. Because for years, no one recognized the pattern. And it wasn't just because of lack of evidence. It was also a lack of attention. Most of the victims were vulnerable people, and that directly affected the urgency of the investigation. It shouldn't have, but it did. And that's a hard truth to face. If the victims had been different, would it have taken this long? That question remains, and it still matters today, because this case isn't just about one criminal. It's about how society responds, depending on who the victim is, and that needs to be talked about. Another point experts highlighted was how his behavior evolved over the years. At the beginning, there was caution, planning, longer intervals, but over time came confidence, repeating without consequences, created a sense of safety, and that led to something common in cases like this: escalation, more frequent, more daring, less fear of being caught, until, inevitably, a mistake happened, and that mistake was enough. It shows something important. Even the most careful plans eventually fail, and when they do, everything can change quickly. But there's another side to this story that often goes unnoticed: the role of persistence. Because even with difficulties, even with limitations, investigators kept going. They revisited cases, re-examined evidence, and when the opportunity came, they acted. That made all the difference. Without that persistence, this story might have ended very differently, and that deserves recognition too. Now, if we look at all of this more broadly, there's an unavoidable reflection. How many stories like this exist that have never come to light? How many patterns haven't been recognized yet? How many people remain invisible? These are difficult questions, but necessary ones, because cases like this don't start suddenly. They build over time, in silence, and often, they're only recognized after irreversible damage has already been done. But if there's something to take from all of this, it's the importance of paying attention, of listening, of taking reports seriously. Even when they seem small, even when they seem isolated, because it was exactly one report. Seemingly simple, that changed everything in this story. One person who chose to speak, and that was enough. Enough to connect years of crimes, enough to identify someone responsible, enough to stop it from continuing, and maybe enough to save lives. Now I want to ask you something. How many times do we ignore signs? Because they seem too small, because they don't seem important, because they don't involve someone relevant? This story shows that can have enormous consequences, and maybe that's the most important part of all. Pay attention, because sometimes what seems insignificant is exactly what's missing to understand everything. And in the end, that's what happened here. A detail, a mistake, a decision, and everything changed. If you made it this far, you've probably realized this isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about invisibility, about attention, about consequences, and above all, about how small moments can change entire lives. Now tell me, had you ever heard about this case? Because that's the most disturbing part. Even though it's one of the longest, most persistent, and most impactful, many people have never heard of it. And that says a lot. If this kind of content makes you think, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We try to understand what's behind them. And if you want to keep exploring this topic, there's another video on your screen right now. That will hook you from start to finish. Thanks for staying until the end, and I'll see you in the next video.